Hi there, good evening. This is Abhivardan. We are here for quote unquote an IRL, a roundtable, or let us say a roundup after a long time for the Bharat Pacific. I think last time when we had done it was about semiconductors, and we repeated that 2 times because Semicon India is also coming up in a few days in Noida, in a few weeks to be fair. So this time, this was a discussion which was we had planned long enough, like in July, to do it, but things are piling up. There were things. So tonight we have some interesting speakers to discuss about India's national security legislation, the National Security Act 1980, in terms of how it covers the role of foreign journalists. Now, why this is an interesting discussion in Indian context, I think the reason which is interesting is that a lot of foreign journalists work in business capacity or certain non-profit capacities and otherwise in advocacy sometimes as well, and they actually try to participate in certain aspects of our affairs. Sometimes it could be related to government, sometimes it might be related to the private sector, sometimes it might be related to NGOs, but even media otherwise, how does it affect things? Because there have been some recent scandals around which have necessitated, because this came into our mind, we were discussing on X, and it just came into our mind that and I would give a shout out to IXG guy. He's not here unfortunately, maybe I think he got busy or occupied, but thanks to him, thanks to his also shouting out. And I was like, okay, let's do a discussion from a legal as well as a bit of a strategic and policy perspective, but we'll keep the legal perspective at the center. So let me introduce everyone quickly. We have Rishap Vats from NMIMS. You know him on X. He's a great commentator on geopolitics, Pakistan, Bangladesh, West Asia, counterterrorism. He's actually the go-to guy who actually talks about critical questions in the best way. Then we have Advocate Nikhil Mehra. He's a well-known criminal law practitioner, advocate in the Supreme Court of India. Happy to have him. And we have somebody from IR journalism who's going to be more in the role of asking some questions and understanding how this goes through. So we have Shashank Mattoo from India Today Global, a good friend of mine, and we have our most favorite, I'll not say that word, most favorite Aditya from Bharat Pacific. So yeah, long time it's been, and I think we'll go ahead. So
Abhivardan, before others jump
yeah,
in, I have to actually put the context right. Actually, what's the context
sure,
that has actually caused this discussion to happen? And of course, Nikhil, Rishap,
you go ahead.
everyone jumped in. I think it was the Rishap who in Twitter actually highlighted the story about Washington Post national security columnist Max Boot's wife getting indicted for acting as a foreign agent, and she didn't register under the said laws of the country, and Manhattan federal court actually prosecuted her for violating foreign agents registration act. So that was the context in which Rishabh and others, you, Nikhil, etc., actually thought of what about such a law in India, what is the context, if do we have any such laws, and if we do have them, uh, how does it work, and what are the areas where it has to be improved, or like more work to be done basically. So that is the context where basically in this current age of information war, etc., etc., when it is getting so confused to uh, actually track the journalists or columnists who are acting in good faith and who are acting in bad faith, and who are actually trying to navigate the blurred lines. Especially this is true in the case of foreign journalists. So yeah, this is the context what we are discussing on. So continue.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And I think Rishabh, you can take it from here in terms of
And
what do you
just a
feel
second,
like
and
you can add.
how this
Yeah,
actually works in the larger context of freedom of speech and expression. That is also very important, and I think Nikhil
of
will
course,
uh,
of course,
very well explain us everything. And me being a
definitely.
former journalist myself, I'm also quite sensitive on like where does this act, security act works, and how does this act. And I think Shashank is also there, who is a practicing journalist at the moment. So
Yeah. So Rishabh, you can go ahead. I think then we can pile
Yeah,
up
hi.
some points and then Nikhil will come. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks, Vivardhan, for inviting me. So yeah, basically, Aditya was right that this entire thing popped up, we started thinking about this, and I mean, I'm sure many people have written about this already. And I was writing something with regards to influence and the exercise of power in the legal context, essentially. But I thought about it in the international context, and we. I mean, I essentially came across not just the role of journalists who are essentially acting on behalf of foreign governments, but also of corporate entities, or essentially people who are lobbyists of some sort, to put it very mildly, and how they essentially further their country's interests, their personal interests, or, for example, the financial interest of a corporate entity abroad. So this whole idea, essentially, and I think Aditya was right, that we should not entirely look at it from a national security perspective alone. Obviously, that's the major thing, but we have to be mindful of the fact that influence is not always bad. I mean, there are many interest groups in our society, and lobbying per se is not bad, because it essentially means that any activity of a group or an individual, where you're trying to essentially put forward your special interest, and you're designing to influence the legislative or the regulatory framework of a particular public authority. And many people do it, and that's totally fine. We have farmers association in our own country, women organization, trade unions, etc., etc. And similar, I think in India we've had a similar discussion with regards to foreign funding of NGOs, etc. And there are similarities to it, of course, but when we're talking about specifically individuals, right, especially in the context of journalists, I think we still have to go back to some of the discussions that people are having in other parts of the world, especially in the context of America. So I was reading up, how essentially the legal process in America evolved, and I obviously came across many things on this. There is something called as the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which has been in existence since 1995. There is something called as the Honest Leadership and Open Government Act, etc. And all of this, essentially, all these things, and obviously we also have something called as Foreign Agent Registration Act, which is important in the context of journalists also, because in the last 5 to 6 years, some foreign or some state-funded networks in America also have to register, or have had to, or have been forced to register as foreign agents, both as an entity and as individuals, especially when it comes to the editor. So obviously, in the context of Russia Today, I think most of you are already aware of. And this, by the way, the whole Russia Today or action against Russia Today was done before the war, or before the 2020 invasion. Then there is obviously Chinese entities, etc. So I just would like to highlight that point. What do these acts essentially in America, how they try to look at, especially in the context of journalism. So all these acts that I mentioned, they essentially basically try to further the disclosure requirements that required lobbyists in these countries to disclose information, whether it is any issues they work on, the stakeholders or public officials that they meet with, the amount of money they spend, etc., etc. Now, obviously, in the context of foreign agents, there are a lot of other things, but I'll just put this forward, and maybe we can have this conversation in the context of India also later. Uh, there was a very interesting thing which happened in 2017 with regards to Russia Today. Not Russia Today particularly, but the US government, essentially Department of Justice, they try to essentially, try to force this idea that a registration of these entities is very important, because ultimately Russian funded news outlets, etc., have to be registered. So they essentially added a requirement where you had to disclose, quote unquote, any information materials registrants produce or distribute. That means essentially whatever you are covering, etc., right? Everything has to be put forth. They also have to obviously give a very the, actually routine disclosures of how their company's finances work, what is the ownership structure, etc., and also send the DVD copies of the shows that they are going to air on their network, the programs, etc. And this was interesting because it happened in 2017, and was followed by another action, again similar action, where against CGTN, the Chinese entity working in America. And the only difference here was that RT was also required to add one additional filing, where they had to list their emails and phone calls of all the journalists and the people that they reached out to, even sources, etc., and give a list of whatever the issues that they're going to interview people on. So this to me was something which was, I mean, I understand the geopolitical context of it, but this was something which was not done for others, not even for China and Chinese entities. Now, there were questions in the US at that time as well as to why not extend the same courtesy to state-funded broadcasters, not state broadcasters per se, like for example Al Jazeera, right? Now, obviously, we know that because the relationship between the US and Qatar and other countries, especially in the Western sphere, is different. Probably it did not go anywhere. But there were considerations. People, legislators wrote about this, etc. But it didn't go anywhere. Which kind of brings me to the major point here, is that you know is that in countries like India, or I mean, just like in other countries, there are going to be times where we are going to be facing, or we are already facing in many ways, but we are essentially going to be facing some geopolitical challenges. There are going to be pushes and pulls from different sides, different directions, and it is at this moment of time that you think that you know not just in terms of journalists and what they do here, but also in terms of what corporate entities, the representatives of the corporate entities, how are they able to influence government decision making? And even if they are, which is totally fine, we can try to regulate that. Point is, how much of it should be made transparent, right? Now, I can probably talk about this a bit, something after everybody else had a chance to speak about this. But there is, I think, the French example is very interesting here. Something like a model of sorts which we can pick on for India to emulate later. But yeah, the idea essentially was to look at lobbying and influence efforts of not just journalists, but individuals, companies, etc., and how India should or can regulate that.
Okay, I think that's a good context to begin with. So let's begin with some legal background. So I think Nikhil, you know, to
Hi, thank you for having me, Amivardhan, and hello to everyone else. Look, this was really posited to me in the context of the NSA, so I'll give you some legal background in the context of the NSA. See, what Rishap has just explained is a much more sophisticated legal system and a much more sophisticated legal approach that looks at various subtle stages at which influence can be exercised and an assessment of how influence can be good or bad or something that you merely observe, keep an eye on, and then act when needed. The problem with the legal approach in India is we tend to have a bit of an elephant's foot approach. So you have the National Security Act, which creates effectively just a preventive detention mechanism. Now, there have been other examples where journalists have been ousted on the grounds of visa laws. So we feel that there is enough protection there. But those are very harsh steps, if you understand what I mean. And what Rishab is talking about is a more sliding scale of actions. We don't have those. Now, the National Security Act sets up a preventive detention mechanism. What is preventive detention? Theoretically, preventive detention was actually introduced by the colonial era governments, with the idea being that you are in fact detaining a person prior to them committing it, because they are likely to commit an offense. Therefore, the authority that detains will have maximum power and maximum decision-making authority in relation to this. When the Constitution of India was enacted, the popular against freedom fighters in India, perhaps it will find no place within the Indian Constitution. But under Article 22, we incorporated it. Now, 22 gives certain protections to accused at the time of arrest, but it also creates the possibility of preventive detention, defines preventive detention, and creates protection in relation to preventive detention, right? But it only sets out, as the Constitution must, basic legal standards as to what a law relating to preventive detention must do. And so since then, we've had multiple laws that have had preventive detention provisions. A very significant example of which was the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, which is the MISA Act, which was used extensively during the emergency in 1975. And even prior, the Coffee Posa Act, a lot of the times, I mean, we look at this now in terms of, it's actually amusing to me that people who were guilty of minute amounts of hoarding of foodstuff used to be preventively detained for long periods of time, because our economic model was such that anything over and above this arbitrarily selected figure by, in fact, by delegated legislature, would amount to an offense in itself, or would amount to the potential of a greater offense. And so, we had this particular law was set out in that manner. And as is often the case, for the longest period of time, and this sort of mirrors the way constitutional uh, development occurred the world over. For the first 30 odd years of your constitution, the courts are giving deference to the executive. And so the legal theory was, and this is an argument that is reversed later, that preventive detention is under 22. So you cannot use right to life under 21 or right to the various liberties under 19 to challenge what you are doing under 22, because 22 is a standalone section, article. Right? And as a result of which, they would in fact say, we are not even going to look at anything other than procedural compliance. That's all. Were you given the causes on time? Were you detained for a correct period of time? So on and so forth. Nothing more than that. Not certainly to the sufficiency of the reasons accorded for the preventive detention in itself. All of that starts to change. In the late 70s, in particular with the Maneka Gandhi judgment, because Maneka Gandhi's judgment creates the golden triangle of 14, 19, 21. And that's when the court starts saying over time that 22 must be, any action under 22 for preventive detention, for any law passed under 22 for preventive detention, if it is violating that particular law, or if it is violating the circumstances in which that particular order can be passed, then it is immediately violative of the golden triangle of 14, 19, 21. And so effectively, the old jurisprudence is usurped, and 21's effect and 19's effect on Article 22 starts to appear more strongly, more stringently. Nonetheless, you will find that it is very rare, and this is a statistical point, very rare for for courts to actually overturn preventive detention orders, or to overturn them in an effective period of time. You see, today, for example, the NSA provides a 12-month period. Right? I've barely seen preventive detention orders. I mean, I'll give you one example of where it happened in a reasonable period of time, but nonetheless, a 132-day delay. There was an absolutely absurd preventive detention order passed under the NSA against a Manipur journalist in 2018 who was merely critical of the Prime Minister and of the Manipur government at that time, which was also a BJP government. Now, he may have been desultory in the language that he used in relation to Hinduism, in relation to cows, etc., but he wasn't saying anything more than expressing his own opinion. Simultaneously, they had levied a charge of 124A sedition against him, which a court had found to not lie. So he was granted bail in that. The moment he's granted bail in that, they imposed NSA and took him in for 12 months under the NSA. It took 146 days for him to get that order revoked. Right? So 5 months you're in jail waiting for just the procedural exercise of determining the validity of the action. Actually, and really, so that is really the power of the NSA. That's how it shuts you down. That gentleman has then subsequently again had been subjected to NSA, where during COVID he made certain comments saying, look, there are certain BJP leaders saying that that cow dung or cow urine will help prevent COVID, and it will not. And they had again imposed an NSA against him, and imposed NSA against another activist who was then later released by the Supreme Court. And in fact, his detention was found to be so patently illegal that there is a case pending on the scale of damages to be paid. And so therefore, perhaps this particular journalist, Kishore Chandra, Vankhem Chandra, will also be the recipient of damages for that reason. Now, so, when we look at preventive detention, really the key issues are, under Article 22, you could only actually have preventive detention for 3 months. But if you pass a law, Parliament passes a law that allows for more, yes, you are allowed more. If you look at the NSA Act itself, the NSA Act is very, on the face of it, very crafty, in a sense that it says 12 months. That is permitted by Article 22 in itself. But it has a separate Section 8 and 8A, which effectively gives grounds for challenge for a particular order and sets out good procedures, solid procedures for an advisory board. That doesn't mean, however, that good orders only get passed. Right? Orders can be passed of various sorts. The problem that I think occurs, and really I think this will cut through a lot of the stuff, if the executive bodies were to do their work correctly from the start, right, and have enough information of the nature, intent, and action of the person that they're detaining, their orders will always survive, right? They will almost always survive. But if you don't do your work, and if you are acting in a rushed manner to prevent someone who has just spoken out or done something on the other, then you'll be in trouble. Then you'll eventually be in trouble. Look, if you look at the Supreme Court judgments in relation to preventive detention, it's quite clear to me, at least, that if preventive detention wasn't an original article of the Constitution and was introduced otherwise by legislation, then no doubt in my mind the Supreme Court would have struck it down. Because preventive detention actually creates the problem of habeas corpus is literally nullified. I mean, you are produced 24 hours later, you're given some set of orders, but really speaking, there's no bail, there's nothing that particular order continues. Unlike, say, in a criminal offense where you're arrested, you have certain bail provisions. You can actually go seek bail, whether you're granted it or not is a different matter, right? You can even issue a preventive detention order under NSA or under any other act in relation to a person who is already in custody for an offense, as long as you can establish that that person is about to be released, and upon release is likely to commit an offense again. So it's an extremely broad power. It's an extremely untrammeled power. And to me, in the context of what Rishap just introduced, it's a very unsubtle power. It's an extremely draconian power to use for something that needs more of a scalpel.
Yeah, so that's a great addition to be fair.
Yeah,
Because I think
Abhiraj,
yeah,
I
yeah.
had one follow-up question. So, Nikhil,
Yeah,
as you have mentioned the example of a Manipur journalist, so and we have read like several of Indian journalists, this act like they have gone through this process of being arrested for National Security Act, etc. But have you ever seen, at least I don't recall in the recent memory, a foreign journalist being prosecuted or detained under this NSA?
Not under the
Uh,
NSA. Yes.
So even
Return
though
home
Indian government, so even though Indian
for
government has
repertoire.
the power, so even though Indian government has the power, has it ever actually exercised this power against a foreign journalist since the act has been?
I don't see it in the context of. I don't see it in the context of foreign journalists. No, not at all.
I think there might be
Scale
some
of
cases.
another scale of problem.
Yeah, there might be.
Look, I've seen it in the context of.
Go on.
I've seen it in that context. I've not seen actual orders of arrest in context of a foreign journalist, but I'm happy to be correct.
Yeah. No, I was saying that I have seen cases of maybe not preventive detention per se, but using national security grounds. Maybe I don't know whether the laws that they were referring to directly, that they invoked National Security Act per se, but I've seen that the government has, not just this government, I mean, historically speaking, the government has invoked some national security justifications to either rescind visas, or in some cases, and this is more recent, um, so for example, there was, I think, if you held a OCI, if you were an OCI, for example, right, and you were a journalist, and there are some journalists in India who are foreign per se, but they have essentially what you call, they are considered to be OCI. Now, they did not have to get a special permission to work as a journalist in India, right? Because it was considered to be a work, lifetime work visa, whatever. Now, apparently, the Ministry of Home Affairs has come up with this rule in 2021, I think, where now you have to get that work visa specifically, and for people who are even OCI citizens. And there has been a case of this French lady which was covered for a bit, I think, in 2022, and there have been follow-up incidents. And I think in one of these, two of these cases, the government used national security justifications, and in one case, and again, I'm not sure if they used the National Security Act, but the excuse that they gave for not extending her visa immediately, etc., was the fact that she had shot this documentary with regards to Khalistan in recent months. Um, near the Punjab border without taking permission of BSF, etc. So I think there is an important discussion to be had as to, there needs to be regulation, but in existing laws and how they're implemented and enforced in India, obviously they are a bit problematic. And I think Nikhil is right overall when he says that, you know, this kind of regulation in India, I mean, in general, laws are so vague and the way they are applied can be a bit problematic. And this is why I think when I was talking about in my context, lobbying and influence operations, etc., I think we need to be more subtle and or look for transparency rather than punitive actions.
Right, Rishabh, I just want to add to that. You see, it's not even so much about the fact that they are vague. It's that they are sourced in multiple spaces, right? So what you're talking about may be a license to actually act in India as a journalist, as a foreign journalist. It may be a visa requirement. It may be certain other requirements that are licensure in nature, right? But the NSA is, of course, the sort of apex. Like, if you are detaining someone under the NSA, the first thing you are declaring is that this is a person that has acted against the defense of India. That's a very grave charge against a foreign
Yeah.
journalist. So you're not going to see
Yeah.
that come against a foreign journalist that easily, right? And so this is why I wanted to come back to what you were saying. Now, that's a much more refined system in the US, because perhaps they've already been through the effects of the Cold War, right? Like in the Cold War, they've already seen that influence comes in so many subtle ways, and that they themselves are masters at this, right? So sometimes your guilty conscience speaks to the person that you are. They are so good at doing this abroad that they know full well how to actually create the stop gaps to stop people while also maintaining a highly liberal constitutional position, right? So I think that's the sort of problem that we have here. I really, it comes down to the security establishment in India to have sort of one sort of sourced rules, clear rules that will apply. Even after that, and that's something maybe we'll go to later in this discussion, the second bit that you said, the vagueness bit, right? That certainly applies in the context of free speech. But any case on free speech, even if it involves a citizen and not the NSA, involves a normal prosecution under free speech, more often than not has a vagueness problem. That's just the nature of our law on free speech.
But I'm quite surprised by what you have just mentioned, because not only United States, even we have our own historical national security problems, right? We have problems with Pakistan, we have problems with China, and we also went with our own issues of Cold War, while quote unquote unofficially we were the allies of Russia, and yet we have never seen legal precedents with respect to foreign journalists and how they have to be covered within the purview of Indian law if there are such charges. And I'm quite surprised we never had such legal
See, this, sorry, but this is the point where a regulation might specify that whether you are classified as a foreign journalist or you are actually registered as a foreign agent. Now,
Agent, right.
this is the point where we have to be careful of how broadly or how we define it, what are some of the criterias, and let's say even in disclosure requirements, for example. I don't know if you guys have heard, but recently in Georgia, right? Georgia, the country in Central Asia, Russia's neighbor, they tried to come up with this foreign agents law, and obviously this goes without saying. Many countries like Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, all these Russian, satellite states, and the Soviet countries with essentially Soviet legacy, they have this foreign agents law, which are essentially a classic case of how to stifle free speech and activism in general, right? So that's the model as well. But what I found very interesting while looking at the Georgian law was that they essentially mandate, and they say, and they have essentially put it very I mean, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but they say agents of foreign influence, not foreign agents per se. And the way they try to define it as to they look at how much of foreign funding an organization or an individual is getting, right, and for what purpose. Now obviously the certification etc could be a little problematic, and but they have been a bit specific in that nature. So let's say 20% is other if you get the funding for your entire organization, not as a journalist per se but any organization, then you have certain, you have to disclose your financial disclosures etc etc, and then after a certain point you have to essentially be registered and there are certain things you can and cannot do. For example, just to give a very, this need not be something which the Indian government should legislate, but this can be done by voluntary associations, by the media themselves. For example, now obviously in India, we don't have regular press conferences by government departments or ministries, except obviously Ministry of External Affairs. And the way I think, even if we had, the way we regulate it is going to be very strict, and we'll already take care of some of the problematic elements that we would look from our perspective, right? But in America, for example, they have their own reporters associations, etc., and there are certain rules that are made against foreign journalists who are seemingly or registered at foreign agents. They cannot attend some of these events, etc. They cannot, for example, go to the White House briefing room and ask questions and whatnot. So I think my point is that there are examples of bad laws and good laws also, and the way we can enforce them can be more subtle than some of these other countries are doing. And again, I think we should not limit this discussion to journalists per se, because we as a country are having conversation about electoral funding, right? So if you're looking at lobbying, etc., about quid pro quo influence operations by domestic entities, we have to look at foreign entities. And let me be very honest, Aditya was right when he said that we've had a Cold War before, and we were we were a hotbed per se of foreign agents. And this is something which you can read in Cold War history. This is not something me making it up. People actually looked at India as one of the places where you could go and you had a free hand to move around, to meet people, to organize seminars, to have your own influence operations. And we would be absolutely stupid to believe that that is not happening now, or that doesn't happen in a different fashion today. So I think there are subtle ways to do it, but yeah, we can probably carry this discussion. You can ask other
Yes.
questions.
So yes, Nikhil, do you want to add
I
something?
just wanted to, so perhaps, Rishap, in a environment now when our capacities are greater, right? Our policing capacities are greater, our military capacities are greater. Perhaps that is why the opacity serves our purpose. And perhaps this is why we keep it all very opaque. And we do what we have to do in the background. People can scream and yell and whatever, and generally it is in the form of a deportation, and you're out of the country, and that's the end of the matter right there. Right? Otherwise, we are happy, in fact, for a certain degree of negative reportage about India to occur the world over, because permitting negative reportage only, it'll get you up the VDEM rankings. Let me put it that way to you. Like you'll at least be able to show yourself as a country that tolerates criticism against itself, right? So perhaps this is why we like to keep it fast and loose. Now, when you and I are talking about these kinds of laws and specificity in relation to them, let's break this into two parts, right? I do it from a legal perspective, saying how are rights affected. So for me, a detenue is more important from the perspective of the elimination of rights, right? And perhaps you are approaching more from a national security perspective, that how is the national security imperative better protected, right? Now, I think to the national security imperative, they are happier with vagueness. That hurts me as a lawyer. Vagueness hurts me as a lawyer. And what ends up happening as a problem with vagueness is that when you keep doing this very vaguely, eventually you give the courts to say this right, that right, and now we're passing a judgment. Right? And that stuff can happen. And I'll give you an example of where it nearly happened. It didn't, but it nearly happened. The case of Atish Tasir. Now, that is not a national security case or anything of that sort, but he had gone from being an ardent supporter of the government to a critic of the government. And that was essentially because his OCI, I think, was rejected. And again, on his OCI rejection, he had filed a case before the High Court. And eventually he lost that particular case, but the allegations made in that were in relation to your intolerance in general, right? Now, I can see one judge goes this way, but another judge may very well turn around and say, none of this is material to the rights of an individual which you yourself in your legal system have accorded to obtain an OCI, right? So all I'm trying to say is that this vagueness works at the security level, but once the court scrutiny arises, then it's a bit of a roulette game.
Yeah, and as Rishabh said, I would like to take this into a bit from a journalist, and I would rather address it as an individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, an individual Now agents can be of two forms, right? Like we have seen in the case of TikTok. TikTok is a medium. Now agent, that is an individual, and agent, that is a medium. Now for India, I mean, I don't think it needed any law to actually declare TikTok banned in India, right? Because it was quite
Executive
easy.
action.
Yeah, because it was just a medium. But how does it works for a Chinese reporter or a Chinese person or any person like coming as a business entity? I mean, of course, even in the case of business these days, there is a larger scrutiny. Or
But
not only China,
that's
but
you know
so
my sorry, but I got
no,
just an ad. Maybe you can add to it. Key,
yeah, yeah.
ultimately
What I was saying
regulation
is,
तो है ही
how
नहीं.
does this work? Like, are we just going case by case, as Nikhil has
Yeah, it
mentioned?
is like that
Yeah,
ना. There is nothing. What हमको आज वीजा देना है चाइनीज इंडस्ट्रियलिस्ट या कोई वहां से एक्सपर्ट आ रहा है तो देंगे. अगर नहीं देना है तो वी विल फाइंड अ वे. देयर आर हंड्रेड्स थिंग वी कैन यूज. और उसको हम इधर डिपोर्ट कर सकते हैं, वापस भेज सकते हैं. जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल आई टोल्ड यू अबाउट दिस द फ्रेंच रिपोर्टर. Another French reporter, very recent, 2000, like 2024, similar, a guy with a little bit of a shady background, I might add, because I've
Rishabh,
been
just,
following.
just going to take a moment to intervene. The particular
Yeah, sure.
French reporter you're speaking about, who was deported eventually, she had been in India for decades.
That is no. I'm talking about the other one. I'm talking about this other guy who is actually who has an OCI status, right? Who has OCI, essentially his working permission, etc., was granted, and he felt that he was being charged by XYZ about coverage. And here, in the case of this particular person, the charges were absolutely like even more vague than you would normally see in cases of other journalists, etc. For example, I told you also about the BSF thing, Avani Das, etc. Uh, MEA first said that we haven't even, we actually wanted to give her visa, she didn't give, and then some people said that, oh, actually she had to relocate to Australia anyway for some personal reasons, and initially they didn't give her visa, whatever. But let's be honest, there were multiple reports. I remember sharing one from the print itself, which said that people in the MEA, deliberately knowing that she went too far in some of the coverage, etc., they looked for a reason, and one reason which they got was the fact that she didn't take BSF's permission while filming near the border, India-Pakistan border in Punjab, and they used it against her. Maybe they delayed it, etc. My point is, in the context of not just journalists but any other individual or entity, the thing is that abhi punitive actions may we can use whatever we want, and that's the essential problem, right? And in that regulating bit, right, especially in the context of influence and lobbying, right, I think we can come up with good laws or regulations in general. Doesn't have to be a legislation, although I mean it's a double-edged sword. You want to have a legislation because you want to make it more proper, more participatory, everybody gets in the etc etc, maybe refer it to a parliamentary committee, etc. But at the same time, that when there is a law like this which comes forward, the way it is worded, etc., it's going to be so broad, and the way it can be misinterpreted is probably going to be another kind of an issue. So my point is, ये सब de facto करने से कुछ होगा नहीं, and in the case of journalists, you can get away with it, right? The point is to essentially make it more transparent as to what ये कौन सी entities हैं, which are these entities, because remember in India, the lobbying or the bidding, if you're bidding on behalf of a government, you are not going to come through an NGO. I mean, you do come through an NGO, but you are going through various loops essentially to actually reach the government. Now we have talked about the rise of consultants, and abhi log baat kar rahe hain, for example, government and bureaucracy at multiple levels are interacting with these individuals, right, for their work, which is good work, needed work, etc. Point is the kind of access these guys have, right? Private companies, consultants, etc., consultancy firm, the kind of access they have to these individuals, right? We have no way of regulating it. And here I would like to just put forward as to how France deals with it. And I think it's not very harsh per se, but maybe we can discuss this a bit later. So they have they have first, what they've done is they've come up with independent regulatory authority, okay, it is known as HAT VP. It's about High Authority for Transparency in Public Life. Now what it does is that it looks for any conflict of interest itself, and it also counsels, especially the government administrators and bureaucrats. It counsels and helps them to essentially, see, okay, where can that conflict emerge. Now, obviously, you can say in the context of India or any other bureaucracy, it's naive. I mean, sabko pata hi hota hai kya thoda, you kind of know. But still, I think it's still important, because many of my friends who are in the bureaucracy who are just coming up, they also say the same problem, that the line is blurred, when it is a gift coming from a local businessman, right? So how do you navigate those things? So I think similar things can be done and should be done for foreign companies, etc. But look at, I'll just quote this here. So they have this creation of statutory registers, where lobbyists or whoever is essentially, and here again we can go beyond journalists here. Even lobbying in India is, not regulated at all, right? And I think there's a scope of some good legislation also. Now these guys have to register themselves, report their activities, any communication or meetings that you take with public officials. This has to be, you have to disclose it. Anything, if any failure on your part will obviously result in some punitive measures. So any expenditure, any other, time frame of your meetings, etc. All of that, I think, is important when they're meeting public officials. Now, what other things which they do to forward their country's interest or talking points, etc., I think, yeah, that is going to be a little difficult to regulate, especially in the media sphere that we have. I mean, I can tell you myself that so many people, even on Twitter, some of these individuals and entities through third parties, they try to reach out, right? And say, oh, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that, etc. Now, obviously, there's nothing, no harm in it, right? But these are things which individuals, you take it. But thing is, we people like us probably don't have access to, public officials. But there are people, and we know this, how bureaucracy works in India. There are people who probably do not. So I think my concern is that influence can be peddled in many ways, right? Not just through journalists. And the main idea is influence peddling is not bad per se, that we can regulate it. We don't have to make it illegal. My point is that ultimately you give a regulatory framework to it, make it more transparent, and especially in the cases of corporates and larger entities, make sure that they have certain disclosure requirements. I think this can be done, and this is again for national security reasons, of course. But I think this should be discussed in a more, not just in the terms of national security. I think this is just a transparency kind of like initiative. Similar cases, and we've had debates in the domestic context also. So I think in that sense we have to be careful, because ultimately, if any public authority and the decision making is being affected or influenced in any fashion, right, especially in the foreign affairs context, I think then I think that there needs to be a more serious discussion on this.
I have a couple of points before Abhivardhan and Nikhil jump in. Like, first point being, I think in cases of like for India at least, China, Pakistan, I don't think you need any legislation. It's quite clear. They are basically advocating the interest. Like if you know a certain person is Chinese citizen or a Pakistani citizen, we know what to expect from that. So it's a de facto transparency. Indian state knows what to expect from that. So I think there is less danger from there. The more danger is from countries that are supposedly friends of yours, and there it becomes quite tricky how to regulate them. Where do you draw the line of intervention, etc., etc.? Now, and even the free
But
speech.
Aditya, that's the point. We don't have to make it ad hoc. We don't have to make it ad hoc. If there's a requirement, the discussion we started from was from that South Korean Max Boot thing, right? South Korea is a US
Yes,
treaty ally. The point
yes,
is,
yes.
obviously, in the case of US, it's a patron client thing, right? Everybody lobbies, everybody knows, because they have a law, because certain countries don't want certain punitive measures to be imposed on them, and others want more friendly policies. Like, for example,
But,
South
but
Korea.
Rishabh, here challenges. For example, take the case of CAA. It's a different thing. Now, US has something similar like CAA, and yet they made it out of a whole discussion about democracy versus autocracy, right? So any discussion by the current regime, I don't know how they will do it if there is tomorrow a Congress regime. But under current regime, any even entertaining such an idea will be again termed as, even though they have such laws, as autocracy versus democracy. It becomes a completely different diplomatic challenge altogether, basically. So I don't think so. What Nikhil has said is right. Like, the government thinks that it is best to navigate on the background rather
No,
than
but
making a.
this is not about diplomatic pressure. Understand this. I'm not talking about somebody, you cannot regulate criticism. That cannot happen. Point is influencing policy, not through direct. See, obviously, if America wants to put pressure on India, it can do through diplomatic channels, perfectly legal. We are not trying to regulate that. The question is if there are individuals and entities in India who are, and again, as I said, influence peddling is okay. If you want to even try to lobby the government to not do it through other entities, that's fine. But the point is that you should be able to, and we should be able to, as a public, access that information if there has been any approach made, right? Now obviously a lot of it happens informally, right? That's a concern. My point is, there are, lobbying in America also is, I mean, people have, there's a case to be made that that is also kind of legalizing corruption to a large extent. But my point here is, even if you have a Chinese person, right? Let's say somebody reaches out to some Indian journalist or whatever, or Indian commentator, whatever, knows that this guy is in need of financial help, gives it, five or whatever etc amount of money, right, and tells them to write an article. Now we obviously cannot ban that, right? We cannot say no, you cannot write it. Of course they should be allowed to write whatever they write in any platform that they choose. But for example, if you have that law in place where they have to disclose what money are they paying to whom and for what reason, then you have certain, that can be flagged at least. And again, this is not for the government to use against the person individually idly. They might use that information to embarrass the person etc, whatever, for whatever reason. But ultimately, if you're writing a piece of journalism, you're anyways putting your name on that particular article and you're putting it out there. So there's a very important case, I think, which is a clear case of espionage. And I'm bringing it here not to make it confusing, but it can sometimes help. For example, there was a guy, I won't say his name, he was a defense reporter, and he was paid money by a Chinese news entity, legit state media entity, to write a few articles. And this is 2014-15, and 2-3 years ago, he was caught by the NIA, because after some of these journalistic projects that he was handed out, right, legit totally, he was then also given money to distribute among individuals who could then relay it to others to get some on ground data, or to talk to some people in the defense establishment and get some information regarding naval vessels etc etc. Now, though that person, I will personally share with you how that essential case went. Now my point is just this, that not just China and Pakistan, but in general also, if we have those kind of disclosure requirements, certain transparency, things which are essentially, regulatory framework of sorts, sometimes it can actually help the government. Maybe not now. Let's not look at it how our legal function, works right now, but maybe in the future, right? Maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, I think India would still. I mean, people have a thinking that we'll be this country, that country, we'll have so much power, nobody will mess with us, 10 trillion and you can forget everything. No, obviously not. Even if you're 10 trillion economy, people are going to influence. And the whole point is to streamline this, to formalize a framework. So in some cases, it might even work as an early warning system, in my opinion. But and that's the point. It should not be कि China Pakistan है तो हाँ समझ लेते हैं कुछ rule निकाल के we will work against them. I don't think that's how it should work. Obviously, in US also, FCC and this FARA law is selectively used in many ways. That is true. That's always going to be there. But remember, Qatar is, or Al Jazeera is able to not be charged under the FARA thing because you also have lobbying framework and regulations there also, which helps the Qataris to essentially fund a large part of their public sphere and discourse, in America. I mean, I won't like to go into detail, but I think most of you are aware of not just think tanks, but how much of money goes, Qatari money goes in the American media scape. So my point is just that we don't have to make it too punitive, but at least look for disclosure, some framework.
Right. Aditya, you had a second point to add, right? Then I can just.
No.
put on
I just
this.
wanted to comment, right? Like we have been saying journalists, right? The only reason why everyone focuses on journalists, especially in these cases, is because in any other case, you know what their objective is. If a businessman comes, we know they are going to advocate on behalf of certain sector. There's going to be an underlying bias in their advocacy or etc. etc. The focus is on journalists because journalists come with, at least on paper, of course the credibility is at an all-time low at the moment, but at least on paper they are supposed to be moral, objective, non-partisan, etc. etc. So that is why the specific emphasis on journalists, because they can hide behind those uh, adjectives quite easily. So that's why it makes it even harder for to actually track them, or like know if they are actually acting in good faith or bad faith. That's the only point I wanted to make. Otherwise, on the other cases, it's quite easy to know if they are acting. Of course, in the case of social services, NGOs and all, it's also kind of tough, but journalists carry, at least on paper, a certain degree of legal moral uh, standard, basically. Yes, Abhivardhan.
Yeah. So I think we have kind of doubled down and discussed a lot about the state of existing.
I'll
Yeah,
interject for a moment, Abhivardhan.
sure.
Because a lot is being talked about in terms of a formal legal framework. Let's just separate out various things here. Perhaps what Rishap is referring to is that there are too many subtle actions that occur from foreign players within your soil for all of those to be encompassed in the law in the way in which it exists. Obviously, the counterpoint has been, in just as a discursive counterpoint, not even really a counterpoint, but that the design of the law seems to be a deliberate opacity. But let's be clear about certain elements here. Lobbying per se is not legal in India. I say this because lobbying per se is not seen as a fundamental right or a right in any country. And so, if lobbying has to occur because it creates an interface with public individuals, lobbying needs certain laws. There are no laws in India in relation to lobbying. Therefore, lobbying is deemed to be per se illegal because it is always seen as the other face of corruption, right? So, what ends up happening is a lot of policy advocacy happens at the NGO level, right? And now, how do
Exactly
you
my
deal with
point.
that? Yeah,
Sorry,
one second.
exactly my point.
Yeah. So how do you deal with that? So one of the things that they do is this FCRA, right? Foreign money regulation is one of the strongest ways by which they deal with any of these NGOs that are promoting any kind of influence upon policy from a seemingly foreign perspective, right? Even NGOs as sort of well established as the World Wildlife Fund, right? Or what used to be called the World Wildlife Fund is now the Worldwide Fund, which really just deals with aspects of nature, deals with aspects of conservation and preservation. Even they have been left on tenterhooks at times on whether their FCRA will be renewed or not, to what extent it will be renewed, where the money will come from, how the money will be used, right? So, where I think Rishap is very clear, and this is an important distinction. The legal framework I'm telling you literally looks at them and says, I am going to look at how you the content of the action, and we are not really having laws in relation to the content of the action. That is the context in which the NSA argument, because NSA is to the content of the action. Now, NSA, when you deal with it in the context of the act, on the content, so I get the feeling when you deal with FCRA, you're dealing with the right to associate. So I get the feeling legally what the state wants to do is it wants to deal with certain rights that it can offset easier. They can often deal against. Uh, Freedom of trade is something that they can often deal against because our courts have obviously been light on these. Right? Freedom of trade today or policy, it's just a design of policy. There is nothing left in terms of a liberty anymore. Really speaking, in terms of a liberty anymore. It's just that the framework itself is liberal, so therefore there is no larger problem. But in terms of a court of law striking down a piece of legislation as being contrary to Article 19(1)(g), very rare, very, very rare. Right? So I think they're sort of choosing which rights they want to be in contact with and which they don't want to be touching. Right? If you look at other frameworks that they have, they tend to prosecute on very bad laws. So again, going back to Rishabh's point, you are not doing the subtle things, which will be disclosure items, like he was talking about. And those disclosure items, like he very astutely pointed out, can be for warning signals. But what you end up doing is when a thing occurs, you just come at them straight away with a prosecution, right? And so it will be something as stringent as sedition. It could be various other legislation, sometimes UAPA. You will not find them using UAPA and sedition, etc., against foreign journalists of a certain ilk, but you will certainly find them against domestic journalists who are in specific theaters, right? So in Kashmir, you will find it consistently. In Chhattisgarh, you will find it consistently. In the Northeast, you'll find it consistently. So I think that's the sort of piecemeal way in which we've gone about it. But I do agree with what he's saying. I think there's a lot more commentary now on the more subtle designs and the more subtle ways in which we are seeing influence being peddled within our larger public discourse. And for some of us, this is actually, and Aditya pointed to this, the manner in which the debate around two very important legislation, one was the CAA and the other was the farm laws, was manipulated online and globally, was actually stunning. Now think of it in the context of what is the prosecutorial response, right? You picked up one chit of a girl, like she was 19, 20-year-old activist girl who you arrested, Delhi police arrested. You didn't go after, knowingly, you didn't go after the people who actually raised the flag on Red Fort. You went after this girl, Disha. And if you'll remember, a very famous term that became popular that time was the toolkit. That you're following a toolkit. Now, what is this goddamn toolkit? The toolkit is essentially an instruction manual where there is a coordination and a cooperation across entities around the globe. Now, I'm making Rishabh's point here. You fail spectacularly in relation to that, because now what happens, right? Like I was saying, there are certain rights against which you don't want to come up in court. So her case gets reduced to, what have I done? I am only dealing with this as a free citizen who can be critical of the government of India. And I can obtain my criticisms through foreign reading. You can't stop me from doing that. That can't be termed as a toolkit, right? Whereas if you have disclosure requirements of the sort Rishap is talking about, then perhaps there are organizations whose actions you are keeping in light, saying these are people who try to foment problems, right? And foment problems by creating narratives that do not otherwise have any basis in reality. And there's a prior example of this. In fact, the greatest example of this that the UPA always gets beaten up with is Kudankalam. In the context of Kudankalam, it was, in fact, Manmohan Singh was the first person to say there are foreign NGOs that are causing completely fictitious riots and the closure of important national assets in this country, and they must be dealt with under preventive detention. So there were entire villages who were put away for preventive detention under that during that particular protest. More than 5,500 people during the CAA protest.
And right? If I'm not wrong, if I'm not wrong, Chidambaram used the term urban Naxal during that time only.
That's right. So I'm saying, so there is too much unsubtlety to this particular approach in the way in which we are doing this, right? But the net effect is this. I don't think we've been, as an example, been able to make progress. And to me, the dearest I think could have economically transformed India in the future, right? It could have been transformative immediately to your growth patterns in itself. Transformative in terms of your social structuring, because it would hit at dominant castes by the economic control over agriculture. Because agriculture is such an integral part of the rural social fabric and economic fabric, right? So it could have. What are you doing? You don't actually you argue against the protesters. You have to pitch it as high as saying there are Khalistanis amongst them. So what are you going to do? The court is not going to turn around and say there are 10 lakh people at the border, they're all Khalistani, please arrest them under sedition. That's not going to happen, right? So if that's not going to happen, how do you actually go about attacking these kinds of places? And that's where the point that Rishap makes is a very important point. So yes, your vagueness helps you in certain things. It will not help you in situations like these.
And just to make it, because you're talking about farm protests and toolkit, it is so interesting that that now that word is used, like, I mean, we know what it means and etc. Toolkit is exactly, it's essentially a collection of talking points, right? Which is very common in almost all level of interactions, whether it is in UN and other other multilateral forums, etc., and in private communication, and especially NGOs. What kind of talking, or what are your talking points? What are you going to push in the media? What are your supporting arguments, etc.? Now, in this particular case, the Disha Ravi case, I remember this case very well, and one of the things that she was essentially, because she shared a platform with a organization which was a front of a terrorist organization, etc., and that led to this whole thing and this toolkit becoming a point. So I think it was PFJ, right? I think it was something Poet for Justice, something. It was like a foundation which was essentially linked to the SFJ in the US, right? So here I'm pointing this out not to essentially point out what the government logic was, but essentially to point out that if the things that I'm talking about would have been made clear, or if there was a framework of sort, it would probably become easier, not just for the government but also the judiciary and the public in many ways, to hold the government accountable. Because then you're not just dealing with toolkit, whatever. You have to see, if she has a toolkit or set of talking points and she's pushing forward that point of view kisi ke sath bhi, on behalf of some NGO who has had funding from XYZ individual or country, that's fine. Point is, if there is a financial transaction, remember everybody said how much, I mean, I'm saying this in jest, of course, how much Rihanna was paid for that tweet. Remember, what if some individual was paid for that tweet, etc., right? And by an organization which had some links to, let's say, XYZ country. What then? If there are disclosures of that nature, that is my point.
Especially in the context of a tweet which is factually misleading or incorrect, because
Yeah,
then it is
exactly.
by definition a propagandist tweet.
So let's say, for example, you are a private individual, you're working for some minister in Canada, right? And you have put out a tweet or whatever. Let's say you helped in contributing to a report which talks about legislation in India. And let's be honest, this is not hypothetical anymore. Sitting member of parliament and legislatures outside India have, they're not just picking up and talking about it for 10 minutes, they are holding hearings, etc., right? Now what if you're an individual who has pushed your particular MP, right, or the guy you work under, to push for it, and let's say you have been in some ways remunerated to speak XYZ in some other country. My point is, in Canada, France, etc., that will be flagged because they have certain frameworks. Now, I totally agree that in India, how we will formulate it, how we will use it, and how we will misuse it is going to be a long debate, and probably that is something which will be very difficult to solve. I think in this case and in many other cases, um, we will probably making it a bit easier for at least the public to understand where these individuals are coming from. If she wants to talk about CA or talk against CA or anything, right? I may consider farm laws to be a great revolutionary thing. If she doesn't think so, she should have the right. She should even have the right to be, essentially have some, guidance or whatever toolkit, talking points from some other NGO, etc. And they should have the right to, be funded, whatever. Point is, how do we regulate it? What are the limits we should put here? In terms of that. And my essential point was essentially not with regards to NGOs per se. It was essentially about corporate entities, and some of these entities which neither fall in the NGO sphere or the corporate sphere, who have a lot of access to Indian policy makers and specifically bureaucrats. I think for my entire whole thing is essentially about that part should be, registered in the public, in some public register or something much
Let
more.
me give you a very interesting example of that. And this is in the context of the smog that you get over North India, right? A part of this is attributed to the delaying of Punjab. And that happens because lobbying created a situation where Monsanto seeds were almost mandated and rice became the principal. right? And that is also, and because of that, there is a delay. And by the time the burning of all of this partly happens, it is by that time the winds have turned and they are moving towards North India. It is a contributive factor. Now, at the time at which this lobbying is going on, there is absolutely no knowledge of this fact. And if you had a recordation of this fact, then you could start challenging these acts a lot easier, right? Disha Ravi's case, why the process doesn't work and why what he's saying would work is if you had registrations in relation to the intent and purpose of particular entities, then you wouldn't for the very first time be introducing the concept of a toolkit in the context of a criminal prosecution where the standard of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. So what in fact, firstly, to define what is a toolkit in the context of a larger conspiracy is a difficult thing. What is that conspiracy in a way in which it is illegal to India is a difficult thing. And thirdly, to do it all beyond reasonable doubt is a near impossibility. So the first time you actually deal with all of this outside of random statements being made by politicians or even the prime minister in the ramparts of Red Fort saying there are foreign powers. I mean, the foreign hand is as old as Indira Gandhi's constant excuse of foreign hand, right? But what does that actually do? How are you actually regulating it? So perhaps we have to look at those specific cases. Disha Ravi's case, actually, Disha Ravi is an example of the larger case of the failure of the farm laws. The problems we face in the CAA, and perhaps those protests only went away because of the arrival of COVID, right? The problems we faced during the CAA, and subsequently, now there's going to, I mean, we can all see it coming. There's going to be a mass agitation on this. Jitni abadi utna haq. There's going to be a mass agitation but being planned or being at least pushed through as far as is possible on this caste census, etc. So, you are not in a position to actually highlight through proper documentation of the government who acted, how and when, and then to act against them. Right? That's a part of the problem that arises here.
Yeah, I wanted to, before we close, I wanted to actually take to a non-Indian case, especially as we are discussing the global examples also, take for example, America. Now, earlier I had mentioned the difference between the agent as a medium and agent as an individual. Now, in the US, we have mentioned, which actually is the reason for this whole debate, that we already know the individuals can be prosecuted as foreign agents if they are not. But what makes it difficult for the United States, like legal system or their government, etc., to actually act against TikTok, which is a medium, foreign agent as a medium? It's very clear, right? It's a foreign agent, but a medium. It's not an individual. What makes it really difficult for a country like America to? It makes it easier for them to act against an individual, and they have regulations for that. But it's become really a hot potato. It's even a discussion point during the current presidential election campaign. What makes it so difficult for the American state to actually take action against TikTok, which is very, very clear? Like, I don't think it can get any better than that. Like, it's a foreign agent directly.
Yeah, so how they've had to deal with that is White House now has made it clear that they are going to push for a bill in their houses for the larger power to ban TikTok. TikTok, I mean, I'm telling you, I know people who are in the sort of tech establishments, the company side, not the government side, but the companies. And they call TikTok like it is literally cocaine being pushed into your veins. It's that addictive. It is that strong in terms of its messaging, and it establishes that set of deep roots. For which reason they do want to act now. But yes, they may have a framework issue, but their larger framework issue does not exist in the context of otherwise in the context of organizations, because they get organizations to register as foreign agents all the time. And if you are an individual in one foreign agent organization, and supposing that organization gets banned for certain actions, it is not as if you can subtly just go create a fresh organization and get away with it because your registration changes. It's not as simple as that. So they've sort of done all of that work, and they're clear about that. I think we're sort of trying to, in this particular podcast, what we're trying to do is debate whether the opacity model of ours works or it doesn't work. And I think the two most recent examples, which are big ticket item examples, have shown that opacity has its own back. Or if you want to be opaque, be brutal, be ruthless. Then you deal with everybody as you need to deal with them and push your laws through. But don't sit and whinge about everything else, that there is a Khalistani mixture, but we are not able to prove that in court, and courts are anyway allowing protests. Why? Because we've not set up a trail. Then you have a problem.
In many cases, what can be helpful is, and I'll just put it in one line. Agar, for example, in certain cases, let's say, because of the relations that are there between two countries, right? Now, let's say there are some requirements that these companies, or some regulations that they have to comply with. Now, let's say, for example, that in 6 months' time, because there are periods, mandated periods कि आपको इतने time के बाद ये disclose करना पड़ेगा, etc., etc. If those things are there, sometimes we need not make it a legal issue. Also, sometimes it can just be about public accountability. The public essentially coming to know that, okay, the government at this point of time knew XYZ was happening, right? It still did not take any action against XYZ entity or the country which was, pushing it at agenda behalf of X entity, right? And they did nothing. And for example, remember how when electoral bond list came out, right? And everybody then tried to, the public and the media specifically, but I think the public did actually a better job of understanding ki kahan pe there is some scope of mischief, and some other, because there are multiple contexts to which who gives how much money and when, right? That part is, I think, very critical. And if we have to understand how these countries or entities work, then I think even a periodic declaration or disclosure might actually go a long way, even if you don't have punitive measures, right? So I'll just give you a very small example, or I'll let maybe Abhivardhan speak, and then I think, sorry, Abhivardhan ko thoda hold up karke rakha hai. Yeah, Abhivardhan, go on.
No. So, see, my thing is that if we are having a conversation which is productive, we are adding some new points. I don't become somebody who messes up in the middle. So that's all right. But yeah, I'll just. So basically, what I was going to say was that let's take this discussion more into the direction of, okay, fine. See, even generally, when we talk about aspects of regulating this, or let us say controlling this, our laws are very opaque. Even in the technology context, if you read the IT rules, there are some interesting problems with them. I don't wish to discuss them. But the 2021 rules, and I think for that, of course, the government is considering if they want a Digital India Act or not, and I don't know when the bill will come. For a second, I think the two houses have their own committees. In the parliament, they keep having this discussion to have a Digital India bill, but then how would it be specific? Because again, from an evidentiary point of view, from a procedure point of view, we don't see any clarity. So my point was, okay, I think maybe a statutory solution could not be a way right now, but maybe I think, as Rishap and Aditya are rightly pointing out, because I wanted them in a discussion, and I think the reason why Shashank is not here because he had some power cut issues. So maybe next time we'll discuss. He told me. So I think we can more think about, okay, fine, a statutory sanction.
ये power cut issue पे NSA जरूर लगना चाहिए. All of these power these guys need to be put in preventive detention for sure. I can't tell you how I've suffered over here and how much reputational damage I've had to cause to India because of this.
No, I agree. अरे मैं खुद झेल रहा हूँ यहाँ पे. वो तो अच्छा है that I am able to handle this, but even I don't know. I think I am also.
I see Abhivardhan tagging some public organization in Lucknow or somewhere in UP.
And what has happened is they call me and say, भैया delete कर दो, मत report करो. मैंने कहा क्यों नहीं करेंगे? You guys don't have a phone number. Call करो, कोई सुनता नहीं. So what can I do? तो मुझे I feel so angry sometimes. And what can I say anyway? But now it's much better. So all my neighbors are like, "You're so nice. You post about it on Twitter," and now it's getting better day by day. So okay. Anyways, so yeah. So why I think so statutory solution I don't think is the way, because it will go the rhetoric way, like it happens in most legislation, unlike in some which makes sense. So maybe a non-statutory approach could be there. What could be essentially done at a level of, okay, of course it's up to the courts how they think, but under the current frameworks, also under the way it is with the new criminal laws. Again, even I have not read it through, it's long and it will take time. But what can be done in a general way? Like Nikhil very rightly referred the farm law situation, that the people who dethroned the flag and just put the Khalistani flag, they were not prosecuted at all. No action was taken. Somebody else was subject to action, and that
They
too
were
in the
actually
worst ways possible.
compensated, many of them, by the way.
Lol. Okay, that is also a new thing to know. But yeah, they were also compensated. Well, irony of the day.
And the
So
one person who needed to be offed was offed. This is how we operate.
yeah, this is how we operate. So in that regard, what could be done? Because if I suggest, if I say, okay, fine, what could be the statutory aspects? Maybe yeah, one limited aspect could be maybe at a basic pre-criminal level or a non-criminal level, just have a registration and then see what could you push, but at least push with consistency. Okay, fine. I think registration of a foreign agent or an entity is something we all kind of agree on, in the sense that I think we have been discussing this. But beyond that, if I say a statutory measure could be there for potential liability, I still keep my hands away on that, because again, we know the opaqueness of it. So maybe I think we can discuss a bit about that maybe as we close through. I think we have discussed some parts of it, so I think that I was gonna refer on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe flirt one small incident recently. Like, of course, Indian executive was able to take swift action against TikTok because it was quite easy to justify it. But how would we handle something like what Brazil is doing to Twitter at the moment? Can we do to Twitter what Brazil is doing to Twitter at the moment?
It is about grievance officers, no, isn't it? I think the primary case before it went to court, it was kind of almost related to our IT rule. I remember that grievance redressal mechanism, जिसमें एक officer या lawyer को appoint करना था representative. I think it's related to that also. So Brazil essentially said no, and then there was a legal dispute. That's what I have read.
But like they went full nuclear, right? I mean, of course, we had our own disputes with Twitter before the
This was
pre.
this was
Yes,
this was Twitter before Musk, so different.
yeah. But like at the moment in this week, like Brazil went full nuclear against Twitter when Musk said that he won't comply. Of course, I don't understand Musk's logic. Also, he has special love for Western and Latin American countries. He always relate his organizational capacities with American legal jurisprudence in those countries. But when it's come to Asia and Africa, he is always okay. I will comply with the law of the land, etc. So I don't
Number
understand
of
his point.
users, yeah. It just comes down to number of users. He needs India. Simple as that.
Yeah.
That's the market power.
Yeah. But like, I don't think we will be able to ever go full nuclear against any American entity like we did with TikTok. That's, I think, prime. And I
Which is
don't
why
think
you
even
need which is
I
why
don't
you
think
need
we want
disclosure
to either.
requirements.
No, we won't want to either. I don't think that's in the spirit of our sense of democracy either. It will be very difficult for us to justify globally, and frankly, even internally, it will be very hard. Plus, if you do this stuff, please understand, yeah, you own a very limited amount of the tech. If you get into tech wars, you're going to hurt yourself eventually.
Yeah, and I think that is not वो influence में नहीं है. That is essentially in some ways with Twitter also what we went through
Yeah,
was
yeah.
essentially a show of force. We were just trying to portray that okay, these have, because remember what happened during COVID, government essentially tried to come up or try to uh, in a more frequent manner send notices to Twitter, and Twitter was being forced to comply on a much more or a higher scale or faster scale, and then they came out with these justifications, sending notifications to people, etc., and that led to this build up. And remember, they fact checked some union minister, if I'm not mistaken. They for the first time, remember the community notes when it initially was open, remember it was not a public community note. Me and you could not write what was right, what was wrong.
yes,
So I
yes, yes,
remember
yes.
some Indian commentator, someone related to BJP. I think it was that guy, the Hindi spokesperson, Sambit Patra. Yeah, Sambit Patra. They community noted him at that time. Okay, and that I think, and I still remember, led to a lot of conversation about, oh, now what you're doing is, first you were just fact checking the news media, whatever. Now you're getting into the conversation of public and political discourse, and it was with relation to some law or some discussion on some regulation. Now that led to the government do all that, and obviously IT rule was a broader mechanism. But I think this is the point. Na, ad hoc नहीं होना चाहिए कोई भी चीज में हो. It's not just about influence and
So
lobbying.
that is why one of the big issues that came up there was then you do not get the benefit of the safe harbor anymore, because now you are not a non-partisan utility. You are actually
It was a
participating in the debate
platform.
itself.
Publisher.
Yeah.
आप हो जाओ.
So you get publisher liability. You get
And
editorial liability.
and recently Mark Zuckerberg also become, and it's on record at the moment, he revealed, right, he actually acted under the pressure of the Democratic Party to in fact censor Trump himself when he was in office at that moment actually. So, and he also didn't publish quite a few articles, and if that was true for United States, I am sure it's true for India and other countries, but our parliament never sent notice to Facebook on such issues, if I'm not wrong. So
Anyway, I'm so sorry. I'm getting a call that I've been
yeah,
avoiding.
we are at the end of the discussion, Nikhil.
But
So
thank
we
you
are
so much,
done.
Abhivardhan. I really enjoyed this. Thanks so much, Rishap and Aditya. I enjoyed chatting with you guys.
Great
And
to talk to you.
hopefully we'll
And
get to
all
do
the
this
best
again.
for your Manchester game. And
Thank you.
All
Thank
the
you
best.
so much.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
So Abhivardhan, just inform the listeners where they can access to this
Yeah,
conversation.
sure. Yeah, definitely. I think it was a fun conversation. I did not have much to add simply because it was from a criminal angle. But I think if we would have discussed technology, then we would have it. But I think, yeah. So of course, this is on YouTube. We'll try to put it on Spotify. So you can search the Bharat Pacific, or you can go to bharatpacific.com. You can actually get all the playlists of ISAIL and Bharat Pacific podcast. So yeah, that's there, of course. And I think it has been a fun discussion. Yeah, I hope it was. I think impromptu in so many ways. That's why it was a natural conversation.
I think
That's why
we
I
can
was
actually break this down into multiple conversation, and I think just one of the places in conversation, Shashank will have a lot of input because of the fact that he is a journalist himself, and he's
Yeah.
probably seeing all this, play out in real time in front of his eyes, and probably knows more
Exactly.
than us as to what it means to be a foreign correspondent of sort. He's not a correspondent, but he knows people who are correspondents
He
per
knows
se.
people. Yeah.
So I think journalist thing is one. I think then there is advocacy and lobbying, etc. So I think this can actually be a series of conversation because this is such a wide topic, and we don't talk about it often. But मैं देखता हूँ कि lobbying का context हमेशा अपने अंबानी, अदानी and domestic
Why
context में आता है.
Hindenburg? Right.
But if you think about it, and it's not even Hindenburg or whatever, but I was just thinking about it.
Yeah.
Imagine if we could know, or we could, as a matter of public record, get correspondence between a foreign entity and government of India or bureaucrats. Imagine the scrutiny and the care with which some of these individuals will actually write and correspond with these people. Now, obviously, it should not be used as an intimidation tactic, but just a matter of public record. I think it will change a lot of things. Imagine if you got to see that exact mail that was sent to Jack Dorsey, or what was the Indian head of the Twitter, the one जिसको बेचारे को भेज दिया था when the IT rule thing was coming. But my point is this.
Yeah.
Imagine if that conversation was made public, how the Indian government approached. It could have changed a lot of things, right? Worse for the government also in many ways. They have to be more careful. They have to be more cognizant. Laws क्या है, rule क्या है, थोड़ा comply करना पड़ेगा. ये this idea that हाँ China के against करेंगे, पाकिस्तान के कुछ भी कर लेंगे, it's a bit stupid.
It's a bit stupid. Like, and see that's the whole problem. We were talking about the IT rules, right? The thing is, I would have gone on the AI side, but why hua tha? They come up with something, and then they don't even know what are they interpreting, and then the loop of problems continues, and then they back off, saying ye nahi chalega. Similar happening with the broadcasting bill. I don't know what was it in the thing for music labels that Minister Vaishnav was angry कि कोई consultation हुआ ही नहीं. There was no talk about it. So this is a problem. Similar aspect in Uttar Pradesh. I don't even want to talk about how their legal department works because their drafting is terrible in English. Hindi mein kehna nahi chahta how it is, but it is what it is. So yeah, I think it has been a fascinating conversation for people. I think I'm ending the live stream, but yeah, we can talk of course after this. So give me a minute. Yeah, everyone, it was nice to have you. So give me just a minute.